Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lee Edwards. I'm chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I'm also a fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. And I'm pleased and honored to be, in effect, sort of a co-host and to welcome our good friend Harry Wu and all of the wonderful people who have been making presentations here. I've done a little study about this issue myself through the years, and some of you, the older among you, may remember, maybe not, perhaps not, a gentleman named Walter Judd, J-U-D-D, who was a medical missionary in China in the 1920s and the 1930s, was then a member of Congress and an advisor to presidents, American here, about U.S.-China relations and about Asia. And I learned a great deal about China from him and about communism. It's a grave failing of our age that the full extent of communism's inhumanity to man is not widely known. Now, I think we'd all be agreed there's no such public ignorance about Nazism. Ask anyone how many Jews died in the Holocaust, and I think they will invariably reply 6 million. And that number has been embedded in our minds by the books, the films, the websites, the lectures, and other information we've absorbed in our lives. And that's as it should be, about what the American scholar Martin Malia called absolute evil, the genocide carried out by the Nazis during and prior to World War II. But ask almost anyone how many people died under communism in the 95 years since the Bolshevik Revolution, and few will be able to provide an accurate answer. They do not know, for example, that Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and the other rulers of the Soviet Union murdered some 20 million people through purges, famines, forced relocations, and the infamous Gulag. And that figure of 20 million may be too low. We don't know. And because the archives are not available to us now. They do not know, the public, the people generally, that Mao Zedong and the other Chinese communist leaders slaughtered some 50 to 60 million people through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square Massacre, and the Chinese version of the Gulag, the Laogai. And that figure, which I've just mentioned, is probably too low, based upon listening to the presentation by the professor, Dick Otter, which we heard here earlier. And if you ask people, what about the total number of those who have died? They do not know that the communist plague, and that certainly is what it was, exacted a death toll of approximately 100 million men, women, and children. And that figure is documented in the Black Book of Communism, written by 6 scholars of the French left and published by Harvard University Press. Well, and if we know if Harvard University published it, it must be true, right? Right. I'm going to challenge Harvard University, Harvard professor. Now, such widespread ignorance about the staggering cost of communism must be confronted and corrected. And in our way, that's what we have tried to do with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. We took a major step toward educating people about communism and its fundamental inhumanity in June 27, 2007, when we dedicated the world's first memorial to all the victims of communism. It's just 2 blocks from this building down here on Massachusetts Avenue, and we invite you to come by and visit that anytime. It's an open site, and there at the center of our memorial, the icon is the goddess of democracy from Tiananmen Square. We made that decision deliberately because we wanted to have an icon there which would present both a symbol of liberty, goddess of democracy based upon our own Statue of Liberty, but also what the Chinese communists will do when you challenge them. They will murder you. On that occasion, some 5 years ago now almost, that the President, George W. Bush, said this: "The 20th century will be remembered as the deadliest century in American history. So it's fitting that we gather to remember those who perished at communism's hands and dedicate this memorial that will enshrine their suffering and sacrifice in the conscience of the world." But we couldn't stop our educational program with just the memorial. And so in June of 2009, we launched the online Global Museum on Communism. It's the first internet museum that tells the complete story of communism, from Karl Marx to the present-day communist regimes of China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, let's not forget Laos, it's under a communist regime, and Cuba. And I'm pleased to report that since we opened the Global Museum on Communism.org, if you'd like to visit it, globalmuseumoncommunism.org, we have had nearly 500,000 visits from, and this to me is an extraordinary figure, 180 countries. So it truly is a global museum. And those visits have come, and those visitors have come from communist nations, including China, Vietnam, and even Cuba. The memorial and the online museum are major components of our mission, which is to educate this generation and future generations about the history, philosophy, and legacy of communism. But we were not satisfied with that educational outreach. So we're now in the midst of creating the first ever curriculum on communism for high school students. It's a dynamic, interactive 9-lesson plan for teachers to help them teach their pupils about communism from Marx to Mao. And I would like to point out that an integral part of the lesson plan is the online Global Museum on Communism. Why? Well, that link is deliberate as well as cost-effective, because we know that the primary source of information for young people, our children, our grandchildren, is the internet. And we know from the worldwide favorable reaction to our online museum that it will be an invaluable tool for high school students and teachers. We hope to have that lesson plan ready and available later this year, ready in time for the school year from 2012, 2013. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about that, perhaps you'd like to have that curriculum in your school, let us know. Now, the need for this curriculum on communism was underscored by the experience of the Alexander Graham Bell School in Chicago. It's one of the best public schools in the city. Now listen to this. In January of last year, 8th graders, young men and women of 14 and 15, were asked to select quotations from prominent leaders that represented either self-esteem or self-awareness. So the students made the selection. Among the 20 quotations selected were the words of Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba, and Mao Zedong, the worst mass murderer of the 20th century. Mao's words, the phrase, the quote that they picked was this one: "Once all struggles are grasped, miracles are possible." Once all struggles are grasped, miracles are possible. Now the quotation is anodyne, vaguely inspirational, but that's just the point. You cannot separate the man and his words. You must consider what he says in the context of who he is. And as we know in this auditorium, and to those who are listening, I hope and pray, Mao was not just a national leader, but you know, if you go to Webster's dictionary, collegiate dictionary, and look up Mao Zedong, that's the way they describe him. Simply a national leader. And that dictionary is the dictionary which is being used in colleges and universities across the country. He was not that, not just a national leader, but a communist dictator who came to power by lying to the people. He promised them a better life and delivered them into bondage. Now, I don't blame the students for their selections. They know little about communism because they haven't been taught about communism and its record of death and destruction over the past century. Furthermore, many of today's teachers were children in 1989 when communism collapsed in Eastern and Central Europe. For them, communism is something that happened long ago and far away. So therefore, we at our foundation, and I think everyone in this room, are determined to tell the truth about communism. And tragically, that it's all too alive and well in China. We persist in telling the truth about communism, including that communism was not a good idea that went wrong. We hear that so often. Communism was a good idea, it just went wrong. Communism was never tried. It was a bad idea from beginning to end. It was, as Richard Pipes, the Harvard historian, an expert on the Soviet Union and Russia, communism has observed, a pseudo-science converted into a pseudo-religion and embodied in an inflexible, that is, totalitarian political regime. Now, our Jewish brothers and sisters understand what's at stake. They understand that history must not be forgotten, lest it be repeated. They keep reminding the world of the Holocaust, crying, never again. Well, we insist on telling what communism does to men like Dr. Liu Xiaobo, who was given a 10-year prison sentence for speaking out for peace and justice and democratic reform in China. Dr. Liu, as you know, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, but was barred from traveling to Oslo to accept the prize. Furthermore, his wife was then placed under house arrest and prevented from going to Norway to receive the Peace Prize for her husband. Okay, we know that in this room, but most people don't know that. We must let them know the truth about what communism does to those who challenge it. Dr. Liu said, I have no enemies, but it's clear that the Chinese Communist government considers Dr. Liu to be their enemy. Why? Because he has dared to challenge their authority. And so my message to you this afternoon is very simple. We cannot, we must not forget Dr. Liu or his sacrifice and the sacrifice of the other victims of communism, including those who died in the Great Leap Forward. We must pledge, and we do pledge, that never again will we allow so evil a tyranny as communism to terrorize the world. Thank you very much. I'm not sure what our schedule is, but if we have some time for questions, I'll be happy to do my best to ask them anything that you might have about our work or what we're trying to do.
Can you give us what is called global music?
Yes, I know it's too long a name.
Yeah, could you kind of like write?
Maybe
we can
I don't know what the Chinese translation for that is. We have to get that, Harry, from you. So global, it's all one word. Global Museum on Communism.
It's all one word.
Yeah, all one word. Global Museum on Communism. Can be lowercase. globalmuseumoncommunism.org.
Okay.
And
Thank
we
you.
do have there, for example, a marvelous essay by Harry on the Laogai. We also have an essay about China under communism. We have profiles on Mao and Zhou Enlai as well. So I think you'll find it a very instructive one. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your illuminating remarks about the communism, having lived through that. I can relate to it very well. My question to you is, communism seems to be overall a blip in history. If you look at Soviet Empire passed and died away, and North Korea on the verge is of dying. What's your take, your view on the prospect of communist China the way it is? Do you still, first of all, view it as a pure blood communist to begin with? And number two is, where do you see going
Right.
in the short term?
Well, Zbigniew Brzezinski, as a political scientist, came up with 7 or 8 criteria by which to judge whether a country is communist or not, is totalitarian or not. And if you look at those, let's say there's 6, or maybe 7, let's say 6. Only one category, and that is the category of the economy, can you say that China is no longer communist, is no longer totalitarian. We know that, and it's a proven fact. But if you look at the other categories, if you're talking about religious freedom, if you're talking about the rule of law, if you're talking about the ability to choose where you want to live or where you want to work, if you want to talk about making and having a multi-party electoral system, the facade which the Chinese have tried to erect at the local area with these elections, it is just that. It's farcical, because they make the selection of who's going to run in those, quote, open and fair and free elections. So in all of those various categories, China is still, if you don't want to call it communist, call them totalitarian at the very least. And so I think that what's going to happen is a couple of different possible scenarios. That somehow they're going to hang on to what they have right now. When I say they, I mean the Communist Party, with its 75 million members, and backed up by the People's Liberation Army. And they're just going to think that they can tough it out by giving up as little in the way of political freedom as possible. But the internet is piercing that curtain which they've erected, and more and more people are willing to speak out. There are more and more people, dissidents like Dr. Liu Xiaobo and others as well, who have that courage, that wonderful willingness to risk their lives. In the long run of things, I think that freedom will come to China. It may be 1 generation, it may be 2 generations, it may be 3 generations. But the Chinese people take the long view, and I think that there is within them, as within the breast of all of us here, and all men, and all women, and all children, is an innate desire for freedom. And I think that desire will overcome even the totalitarian regime, which is still trying to hold on to power in China today. Yes, sir.
It was described that 20th century was one of the bloodiest in the history of mankind, and most of the victims were the 100 million that perished under communism. I have just a couple of questions. When the Black Book of Communism first came out, I lived in France, and it came out in the mid-90s. And I expected an English version to appear immediately, because it's just a matter of translating. It didn't appear in the United States until like 7, 8 years later.
Yes.
There was this lag.
Yes.
And I wonder, why was there such a lag? It seems like there was almost a conspiracy to slow down to talk about the subjects, So what are some of the forces that are trying to camouflage history, deny what's actually happening?
That's such a wonderful question. I'm sure it's one that all of us have to try to come up with an answer. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to be giving a talk trying to answer this very question at the Philadelphia Society in April later this year, and I'm giving some thought to it. I'm reading some things. I would say this question of why particularly so many Western intellectuals made excuses for communism and who became communists themselves. One of the things which I would recommend, I'm sure you have read it, sir, but The God That Failed, which is a wonderful book which came out around 1950, and it was 6 French intellectuals including Andre Gide, the Nobel Prize winner, and a gentleman, a couple of people from America, including Richard Wright, the black novelist, including a gentleman named Fisher, Louis Fisher from here, and also some other very famous intellectuals. What they said was they became communists, most of them in the 20s and the 30s, and even most in the 20s and the 30s, some in the 40s, was because they were ready to give up on the West. They were ready to give up in the wake of the Great Depression. They were ready to give up in the wake of the rise of fascism in Italy and then in Germany. They were looking for alternatives, and they became communists because the communists promised them freedom, they promised them liberty, promised them food, promised them bread, not only themselves, but everybody. And so they accepted and believed the utopian dream, which was offered to them by the communists. And then they became ex-communists because when they realized they were being lied to, that the communists really were only interested in one thing, and that was power, and not in really helping the people. So that's one of the answers to that. And there's also, speaking directly to this idea of the Western intellectuals, a wonderful book by Paul Hollander, who some of you may know, called Political Pilgrims, a classic. And I would urge you to read that as well. And he looks particularly at the British intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw and Sidney and Beatrice Webb and others who came back, and that famous comment, "I've seen the future and it works," in the Soviet Union. Apologists for Fidel Castro as well. It's a wonderful book, so beautifully documented. Yeah, I'm sure, Professor, you're familiar with that. So that we need really to answer this, because somebody once remarked to me that, well, maybe Marxism is not alive and well except in the American universities and the American colleges. I think that's an exaggeration.
True, very true.
I think that's an exaggeration, but there are all too many willing to make excuses and are still caught up in this idea that communism has not been tried, when in fact it has been tried, and every place it's been tried. It's resulted in things like the Great Leap Forward.
Allow me just to add a couple of more books to the list that you.
Please.
A couple of years ago, John Fleming came out with a book called Anti-Communist Manifestos, an analysis of 4 former communists and their works, beginning with Kessler's Darkness at Noon, and finishing up.
Yes,
that's an excellent read. And then the late Tony Judd's book, Past Imperfect, French Intellectuals 1944-56, is brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the quotes I got from the Anti-Communist Manifestos is just, I think, rings so true. We always heard religion is the opiate of the people, of the masses.
Yes.
There's a retort. Communism is the opiate of intellectuals.
Oh, great.
Well, not all intellectuals.
Not all.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Edwards, I don't know, I think maybe the continued embracement of communism in American academia is a little bit overstated, but
Yes.
I do want to ask you this, though.
Who said that?
Hasn't the West, though, been complicit? And China is kind of a special case. The Soviet Union was never a threat economically to the United States that China is today, or Cuba or anything. And the West, even after Tiananmen Square in 1989, and the United States went through back channels to ensure the Chinese that they wanted to maintain the relationship, and then Western capital started to flow back, FDI started to flow back into China by tens of billions of dollars. Have we, in essence, to some degree, created kind of a Frankenstein today, to the point where the West now is so wedded to China, at least in terms of economics, especially in East Asia? China's the #1 trade partner of countries that are our allies, key allies like Japan, Australia, and so forth. What kind of responsibility does the West have for maintaining this communist paradigm that continues in China, and like you said, will probably continue for the next 2 or 3 generations?
Well, I think what it must do is to not only talk and think in terms of economics, but also of human rights, of human liberties. And as long as we keep looking at things only in terms of economics, we're going to find ourselves still depending upon China for buying our bonds and letting us to keep living in debt here in the United States and elsewhere as well. That's why I think it's so terribly important that what Harry is doing with the Laogai Foundation, what we're trying to do with other organization initiatives for China and others as well are trying to do, is to keep focusing attention not only on the economics of the situation, but also the human side, the spiritual side of this question. And I think if we start doing that, then I think we can provide aid and support to the dissidents. And we know there are dissidents in China. We know they're there. They just got to be very careful, of course, because if they speak up, they'll get their head lopped off or they'll wind up in jail for 10 years like Dr. Liu. But we must continue to encourage the dissidents and those who are speaking out for liberty and for freedom. If we don't do that, then we're going to keep finding ourselves enslaved to the economic power of China, which, by the way, is not as powerful as it used to be. I mean, there are some very, for China, disturbing signs of their GDP growth is beginning to slacken off. There are more and more riots in the countryside. More and more people are unhappy about the inequities, income between those who live in the coastal provinces and those who live in the countryside. So there's some real problems, and it'll be interesting to see how this new president deals with them. There are opportunities there for us, but we shouldn't be afraid to bring up things like, let the prisoners go. Stop throwing people in jail because they want to speak out. That's not right. That's not the sign of a nation that truly wants to be part of the international body of civilized nations. Well, I don't want to keep any more questions. I love to talk about China, but do we have any? We can keep going.
No.
Oh, it is time. Okay. Somebody's going like this. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much.